The rail capacity must be prioritized for the eastern transports. Agreed. We need confirmation from Department 4 on the schedule by close of day.
Covering fire, move up! We're running low on magazines over here. Hold the position.
On January 20th, 1942, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa on the shore of the Wannsee Lake outside Berlin. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. One of the men present took careful minutes. The meeting's purpose was to coordinate the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question in Europe, to resolve the bureaucratic and logistical questions that had arisen as the systematic murder of the Jewish people of Europe had moved from policy to implementation, and to ensure that the various agencies of the Nazi state were working toward the same objective with the maximum possible efficiency. The man who chaired the meeting was SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, which controlled the Gestapo, the SD, and the Einsatzgruppen, effectively the entire apparatus of Nazi terror and political control. He was 37 years old. He was, in the assessment of Himmler, who was his direct superior, the man with the iron heart, the SS officer whose specific combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and organizational skill made him the most capable and the most dangerous figure in the Nazi security apparatus. Walter Schellenberg, who worked under him, described him as the hidden pivot around whom the entire Nazi regime turned. Hannah Arendt called him the brain behind the Gestapo and the architect of the final solution. The Wannsee Conference was not the moment when the decision to murder the Jews of Europe was made. That decision had been made earlier, and the killing had already begun. The Einsatzgruppen had been murdering Jewish civilians in the Soviet territories since the summer of 1941. The first extermination camps at Chelmno and Belzec were already operational or about to become so. What Wannsee coordinated was the extension of the murder program from the Soviet territories to the entirety of Europe. The 11 million Jews of the continent that the minutes of the conference enumerated country by country, the systematic deportation and murder that would eventually produce the deaths of approximately 6 million people. Heydrich ran this meeting. He chaired the discussions, resolved the jurisdictional disputes among the agencies present, and established a specific administrative framework within which the final solution would be implemented. It was a piece of bureaucratic work of extraordinary competence applied to a purpose of extraordinary evil. The specific qualities of organizational intelligence and administrative clarity that Heydrich brought to every task he was given applied to the coordination of the largest mass murder in history. He was killed 4 months later. On May 27, 1942, 2 Czech paratroopers, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, who had been trained in Britain and dropped into Czechoslovakia by the British Special Operations Executive, ambushed his car on a street in Prague as he was being driven to his office. Gabčík's then gun jammed. Kubis threw a grenade that exploded near the car. Heydrich was wounded by shrapnel. He died on June 4th of septicemia from the wounds. He was 38 years old. This is the story of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Holocaust, the most dangerous man in the Nazi regime after Hitler, the man who organized the conference that coordinated the murder of 6 million people, and who was killed by 2 paratroopers with a grenade on a Prague street 4 months after the conference ended. It is also the story of what happened after he died, the specific retribution that the Nazi regime imposed on the Czech population, the specific villages that ceased to exist, the specific people who paid with their lives for the act of resistance that killed a man who had been making all of their lives impossible. Before I go further, I want to ask you directly, subscribe if you haven't already. The next episode is about Alan Turing, the man who broke the enigma, who saved more lives than almost any soldier who ever lived, and who was prosecuted by the country he saved for being gay and driven to his death at 41. That story is one of the most important and most tragic in the entire history of the Second World War, and it's coming soon. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it. And if this episode, the most morally serious episode of this series, about the man who designed the architecture of murder and the people who paid the price for killing him, gives you something, hit the like button. Back to Heydrich, back to the man with the iron heart, and the two paratroopers who stopped it. The broader question of what the Heydrich assassination and its aftermath reveal about the specific moral logic of resistance under occupation, the specific calculus of what is permissible, what is required, and what is acceptable collateral damage in the fight against totalitarian evil, is one that the historical scholarship has engaged with in ways that resist easy resolution. The specific context of the Czech resistance to the Nazi occupation was one of the most extreme forms of political oppression that modern Europe had experienced. Czechoslovakia had been occupied since 1939. Its sovereignty had been abolished. Its Jewish population was being systematically murdered. Its political institutions had been dismantled. And the specific terror administered by Heydrich after his appointment in September 1941 had been systematically eliminating the organized resistance that had survived the initial occupation. In this context, the moral argument for assassination, that the deliberate killing of Heydrich was a justified act of resistance against an occupying power that was itself conducting systematic murder, is a serious argument that the just war tradition has engaged with seriously. The specific target was not a civilian administrator or a political official in the ordinary sense. He was the operational head of the machinery of mass murder, the man who chaired the conference that coordinated the Holocaust, the administrator who had been sent to Czechoslovakia to eliminate the resistance that was the only organized form of Czech agency in the face of the occupation. The argument against that the Czech civilians who died in the retribution had not chosen to be the price of the assassination, and that their deaths were a foreseeable consequence of an operation that the Czech government in exile had chosen to conduct for political reasons that the Czech population itself had not been consulted about, is also a serious argument. The specific people of Lidice did not vote to be part of Operation Anthropoid. They were made part of it by the Nazi retribution machinery and by the decision of the exile government to conduct the operation. The specific relationship between the exile government in London, Beneš and his colleagues, who made a decision to carry out the assassination, and the Czech population in the occupied territory, who would pay the price of that decision, is one of the genuinely difficult dimensions of the moral calculus. Exile governments fighting to restore their country's sovereignty have made decisions that cost their civilian populations throughout history, and the specific legitimacy of those decisions is not simple to assess. Beneš's defenders argue that the assassination was necessary for a specific political reason, that the Czech government in exile needed to demonstrate Czech resistance to the Nazi occupation in a visible and dramatic way, that without the specific act of killing Heydrich, the post-war case for Czech sovereignty would have been weaker, and that the specific political objective of the operation was therefore in the direct interest of the Czech people whose deaths the retribution produced. This argument is not without merit. The specific post-war restoration of Czechoslovakia was achieved, and the Heydrich assassination was part of the specific demonstration of Czech resistance that supported the restoration. The argument against is that Beneš and the exile government were making a political calculation that imposed a price on people who had not consented to pay it, and that even a good political outcome, the restoration of Czech sovereignty, does not retroactively justify the deaths of the children of Lidice who were gassed at Chelmno. The moral weight of those specific deaths does not disappear because the political objective they serve was achieved. The honest engagement with this moral question requires refusing the simplification in either direction. The assassination of Heydrich was an act of resistance against the most dangerous administrator of Nazi terror in occupied Europe. The retribution it produced killed thousands of Czech civilians, including children who were gassed in an extermination camp. Both things are true. The moral weight of both things is real. The full accounting requires acknowledging both without allowing either to efface the other. The specific legacy of the Heydrich assassination in Czech national memory is one of the more complex dimensions of the post-war processing of the occupation. The paratroopers are unambiguously heroes in the Czech historical memory, men who gave their lives to kill the most dangerous man in the occupation apparatus. The specific cost, Lidice, the children, is acknowledged alongside the heroism, but the heroism has generally been given the primary framing in the national narrative. This specific framing reflects both the genuine heroism of the paratroopers and the specific needs of a national narrative that is trying to honor the resistance to the occupation without fully confronting the specific price that was paid by civilians who did not choose to be part of the resistance. The full truth of Operation Anthropoid is more complicated than any single national narrative can fully accommodate. The German memory of Heydrich, which is necessarily part of the German memory of the Holocaust, is one that the post-war German engagement with the Nazi period has addressed with the specific seriousness that the scale of the crimes committed under his administration required. The Holocaust memorial institutions in Germany have engaged with Heydrich's role with the comprehensive documentation that the specific character of his contribution to the final solution required. The specific documentation of Heydrich's role, the WWII minutes, the Einsatzgruppen reports, the administrative records of the RSHA, is one of the more complete records of high-level Nazi administration that the archives have preserved, partly because Heydrich's specific organizational culture produced thorough documentation of what his agencies were doing, and partly because the German archives were captured largely intact by the Allied forces at the end of the war. This documentation has made the specific character of Heydrich's contribution to the Holocaust one of the most fully evidenced in the historical record, and it has served as a foundation for the historical and legal proceedings that have continued to address the specific crimes of the Nazi period in the decades since the war. He designed the architecture of murder. The architecture was built, the murder happened, and the man who designed it was killed by 2 paratroopers on Prague Street. And the price that his killing cost was paid by people who had not been asked whether they were willing to pay it. All of this is part of the full accounting. All of it belongs in the same story. That is the Heydrich War. The specific character of Reinhard Heydrich as a human being, as distinct from his role as the architect of Nazi terror, is worth examining because it illuminates the specific quality of the evil that the Nazi regime produced at its highest levels, and because it complicates the portrait of the monster in ways that are historically important. Heydrich was genuinely intelligent, not the bureaucratic intelligence of a competent administrator, but the creative intelligence of a man who could see the full implications of the situation and could design systems that anticipated and addressed complications before they arose. His management of the Reich Security Main Office, the bureaucratic empire that controlled the Gestapo, the SD, the Einsatzgruppen, and the various other instruments of Nazi terror, was a piece of organizational work that reflected genuine administrative genius, however reprehensible the purpose it served. He was also personally charming in the specific way that sociopaths sometimes are, capable of warmth and humor in social settings, skilled at reading people and adjusting his presentation to what the situation required, genuinely attractive to people who encountered him without knowing what he was or what he was doing. He was described by people who worked with him as a man of quick intelligence and genuine interpersonal skill, as well as a man who could turn the specific coldness that defined a professional conduct on and off of the facility that suggested the coldness was not a limitation of character, but a chosen instrument. He fenced competitively. He was a skilled pilot who flew combat missions on the Eastern Front despite the specific prohibition that Himmler imposed on senior SS officers flying operational sorties, because the intelligence about their activities that a captured senior SS officer could provide was considered too valuable to risk. He flew anyway. He was shot down once and crash-landed behind German lines. He was reprimanded. He flew again. The specific combination, the musical ability, the athletic skill, the intellectual quickness, the interpersonal charm, coexisting with the specific capacity for the design and administration of mass murder, is one of the more disturbing qualities of the Heydrich portrait. He was not the simple monster of the straightforward narrative. He was a person of genuine abilities who had applied those abilities completely and without apparent internal conflict to the service of the worst cause in the history of the 20th century. The specific question of whether Heydrich believed in Nazi ideology or whether he was using it as a vehicle for personal ambition is one that the scholarship has addressed. The most probable answer is both, that he had internalized enough of the racial ideology to make the specific work he was doing feel like a fulfillment of a genuine purpose, while also being intelligent enough to understand the political dynamics of the Nazi system and to navigate them with the specific calculations of a man whose primary interest was his own advancement within it. He was not performing ideology he didn't believe. He was not a cynical operator who was using the Nazi system for purely personal ends. He was a man who had become the Nazi system in a specific and complete way, who had so thoroughly identified with his purposes that the design of the Holocaust felt to him like the efficient execution of necessary work rather than like the participation in an atrocity. This specific quality, the complete identification with the system, the absence of the internal distance that moral conscience requires, is what Hannah Arendt was trying to describe in her concept of the banality of evil, though Arendt developed the concept primarily through her analysis of Adolf Eichmann, who was a less gifted and less creative figure than Heydrich. Heydrich was not banal in the sense of being ordinary. He was extraordinary in his abilities and extraordinary in the specific completeness of his commitment to the purposes of the system he served. The WWII Conference, the 90-minute meeting that coordinated the final solution, is one of the most studied documents of the Holocaust, and the specific meeting minutes that Adolf Eichmann prepared under Heydrich's direction are one of the most important documents of the Nazi period. The minutes are striking for the specific character of the language they use. Bureaucratic, procedural, matter-of-fact, addressing the murder of 11 million people in the specific vocabulary of an administrative coordination meeting. The language is a language of policy implementation, not of ideology or passion. The men around the table were solving logistics problems, resolving jurisdictional disputes, and establishing timelines for a project whose fundamental nature was not being debated. Heydrich had designed the meeting to achieve specific outcomes, and he achieved them. The 15 men who left the WWII villa on January 20th, 1942, had agreed on a specific framework within which the final solution would be implemented. The jurisdictional questions had been resolved. The timeline had been established. The practical arrangements had been discussed. The meeting had accomplished its purposes with the specific efficiency that Heydrich brought to everything. For months later, he was wounded on a Prague street. 8 days after that, he was dead. The specific reaction of the Nazi leadership to Heydrich's death was one of genuine grief, combined with the specific institutional anxiety of a regime that had lost its most capable security administrator. Hitler's eulogy was an expression of the specific admiration he had developed for Heydrich. "The most capable man I have ever known," he said, "a man of genius who combined in himself the qualities of the perfect investigator, the leader, and the statesman." Himmler, who had known Heydrich for more than a decade, was visibly distressed in a way that reflected the personal dimension of their relationship alongside the institutional loss. The specific institutional consequence of Heydrich's death, the disruption of the Reich Security main office at a moment when the final solution was in its early implementation phases, was real, though not as decisive as the British had hoped. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who eventually succeeded Heydrich, was a less gifted administrator who never achieved the same integration of the various security agencies that Heydrich had built. The specific coordination of the final solution continued, because the institutional machinery Heydrich had built was self-sustaining by the time of his death. But the specific quality of creative leadership that he had provided, the ability to see the full picture, to anticipate problems and address them before they became crises, was not replaced. The Czech resistance fighters who carried out the assassination, Gabčík and Kubis, and the 5 others who died with him in the cathedral crypt, represent a specific kind of courage that the Heydrich story requires acknowledging. They were not professional soldiers in the sense that Heydrich had been a professional bureaucrat. They were ordinary men who had been caught up in the specific historical catastrophe of Nazi occupation and who had volunteered for an extraordinarily dangerous assignment with the specific knowledge that success would cost them their lives, either in the assassination itself or in the retribution that would follow. They chose to do it anyway. The specific character of this choice, the full knowledge of what it would cost, the willingness to pay that cost in service of a purpose larger than individual survival, is a specific quality of heroism that the resistance fighters demonstrated. Gabčík was 29 when he died. Kubis was 28. The other 5 who died with him in the cathedral crypt were similarly young. They had been soldiers in a country that had been occupied and erased from the map of Europe, fighting for the restoration of a sovereignty that the Nazi regime had abolished. They died in a cathedral, having killed the most dangerous man in occupied Europe, 8 days after he was wounded by their attack. The specific women and children of Lidice who paid the price of their deaths deserve acknowledgement alongside the paratroopers. They did not choose to be part of the operation. They were chosen by the Nazi retribution machinery because of a connection that was at best tenuous, and that has subsequently been shown to have been the product of the specific dynamics of Nazi collective punishment, rather than of any actual operational link to the paratroopers. The 173 men of Lidice who were shot, the 184 women who were sent to Ravensbrück, the 88 children, most of whom were gassed at Chelmno. These are specific numbers representing specific people, and the full accounting of Operation Anthropoid requires including them alongside the account of what the operation accomplished. The memorial at Lidice, where the village once stood and where the specific memorial that was built after the war preserves the memory of what was done, is one of the most powerful memorial sites in Central Europe. The specific form of the memorial, the terrain of the village preserved as it was after demolition, with the rows of roses that were eventually planted, creates a specific physical experience of absence and loss that the textual account cannot fully convey. The children who were taken from Lidice and placed with SS families deserve a specific acknowledgement that the memorial and the historical record have tried to provide. The few who were identified after the war and reunited with surviving family members, having grown up with German names in German families, knowing nothing of their Czech origins, had specific experiences of displacement and identity disruption that the post-war period was only partially able to address. The village of Lidice became one of the most powerful symbols of Nazi brutality against civilian populations and a specific international response to its destruction. The communities in various countries that renamed themselves Lidice in solidarity, the specific political statements that the destruction generated, was part of the Allied propaganda war against the Nazi regime. The destruction of Lidice was used by the Allied governments as specific evidence of the character of the Nazi regime, as the kind of act that made clear what was at stake in the war. This political use of the Lidice massacre does not diminish the specific injustice of what was done there, but it is part of the full accounting of how the assassination and its aftermath were processed in the specific political context of the war. Heydrich's grave was in Berlin. It was eventually destroyed after the war, and the specific location where he was buried is not maintained as a memorial. The specific decision not to provide a gravesite that could become a Nazi pilgrimage destination was made deliberately, and it reflects the appropriate refusal to honor the man who designed the Holocaust. He was buried with full SS honors. Hitler attended the funeral. Himmler gave a eulogy. The man who had chaired the WWII conference was commemorated by the regime whose purposes the conference had served. The paratroopers who killed him are commemorated in Prague, where the Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius maintains a specific memorial to their last stand in the crypt. The bullet holes from the SS assault are preserved in the cathedral walls. The crypt itself is accessible as a museum. The men who died there are honored with the specific attention that the Czech national memory gives to those who resisted the occupation. Gabčík and Kubis died in the cathedral. Heydrich was buried with full SS honors. The children of Lidice were gassed at Chelmno. The women of Lidice died in Ravensbrück or survived and returned to a village that no longer existed. The paratroopers were betrayed and died fighting in a flooded crypt. All of this happened because Heydrich chaired a 90-minute meeting on January 20th, 1942, and 2 men threw a grenade at his car 4 months later. That is the full accounting of the Heydrich War. Reinhard Heydrich was born in Halle in der Saale in 1904, the son of a musician and opera singer, and had grown up in a bourgeois professional household with strong musical tradition. He played the violin with genuine skill throughout his life, and his musical ability was one of the qualities that made him a more complex figure than the simple portrait of the Nazi monster captures. He had served in the German Navy in the late 1920s, had been dismissed for conduct unbecoming an officer in 1931. The specific circumstances involved a sexual relationship that a naval court found had ended dishonorably, and had joined the SS at the recommendation of a friend who knew Heinrich Himmler. His rise within the SS was extraordinarily rapid, driven by the specific combination of intelligence, organizational skill, and the specific character of a man who had internalized the Nazi ideology completely and applied it with the efficiency of a superior mind. He became head of the SS Security Service in 1931, and under his direction the Security Service transformed from a small political intelligence operation into the comprehensive surveillance and terror apparatus that eventually controlled the entire security system of the Nazi state. The Gestapo, the secret state police, came under his effective control after 1934. The Einsatzgruppen, The mobile killing units that operated behind the German lines in the Soviet Union were organized under his authority. The Final Solutions administrative machinery was designed, coordinated, and overseen by his office. Every major instrument of Nazi terror was, in one way or another, Heydrich's. His assignment to Czechoslovakia in September 1941, as Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, responsible for governing the occupied Czech lands, represented an expansion of his direct power from the administrative coordination of terror to the specific exercise of terror in a conquered territory. He arrived in Prague with a specific mandate: to pacify the Czech resistance, to eliminate the underground that was sheltering British intelligence assets and providing information to the Allies, and to increase Czech industrial production for the German war economy. He approached this mandate with a specific combination of carrot and stick that distinguished his method from the cruder terror of some other Nazi administrators. He increased worker rations for Czechs who cooperated with the industrial production requirements. He arrested and executed the Czech resistance leadership. He eliminated the underground cells that had been maintaining contact with the Czech government in exile in London. He was, within months of his arrival, achieving his mandate. Czech industrial production was increasing, the organized resistance had been disrupted, and the territory was quieter than it had been under his predecessor. The Czech government in exile in London, under President Edvard Beneš, had been watching Heydrich's progress in Czechoslovakia with alarm. The specific pacification of the Czech resistance was removing the intelligence assets that the British SOE and the Czech intelligence services depended on in the occupied territory. The decision to assassinate Heydrich, Operation Antipoid, was made in London and implemented through the SOE training and deployment of Czech volunteers. The specific decision to assassinate Heydrich was one of the more carefully considered targeted killing operations of the entire war, and considerations that informed it included both the specific military and intelligence objectives, removing the most dangerous security administrator in occupied Europe, disrupting the pacification of Czech resistance, and the specific political objective of demonstrating Czech resistance to the Nazi occupation in a way that would strengthen the case for the restoration of Czech sovereignty in the post-war settlement. Josef Gabčík was Slovak, born in 1912. Jan Kubis was Czech, born in 1913. Both had served in the Czech military before the German occupation, had escaped to France after the fall of Czechoslovakia, had evacuated to Britain after the fall of France, and had been recruited into the SLE-trained Czech Special Operations Program. They were dropped into Czechoslovakia in December 1941 and spent the following months hiding with Czech resistance families, learning the specific routines of Heydrich's movements, and preparing for the assassination. The specific details of the assassination: the curved road at Holsovice and Bilovka, the Sten gun that jammed when Gabčík aimed it at Heydrich's open car, the grenade that Kubis threw that exploded near the rear wheel, Heydrich drawing his pistol and pursuing on foot before collapsing from his wounds, have been documented in the specific accounts of the surviving participants and the subsequent historical investigation. Heydrich survived the initial attack. He was taken to the Bilovka hospital in Prague and treated by German surgeons who were flown in from Berlin. He deteriorated over the following days, developing septicemia, blood poisoning from the fragments of the car upholstery and shrapnel that had entered his bloodstream. He died on June 4, 1942. The Nazi retribution was swift, extensive, and specifically designed to demonstrate that the assassination would cost the Czech population a price that no military or political objective could justify. Himmler, who had been personally close to Heydrich, directed the retribution personally. On June 9, 1942, the village of Lidice, a mining community near Kladno in Bohemia, was designated as the target of collective punishment based on a tenuous and ultimately false connection to the paratroopers. All male residents of the village over 15 years old, 173 men and boys, were shot. The women, 184 of them, were sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children, 88 of them, were separated from their mothers. Most of the children were gassed at Chelmno. A small number who were judged suitable for Germanization were placed with SS families and given German names. The village itself was burned, the ruins demolished, and the ground plowed over. Lidice was erased. 3 days later, the village of Lizaki was destroyed for the same reasons. The village had been used as a radio transmission point by one of the resistance groups. All adults were shot. 2 of the village's children were Germanized. The village was demolished. Gabčík and Kubis, along with 5 other Czech paratroopers, were betrayed by a Czech collaborator and died on June 18th in the crypt of Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague, where they had been hiding. They held out for hours against hundreds of SS soldiers and Gestapo agents, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted and the SS flooded the crypt. They died rather than surrender. The full scale of the retribution for Heydrich's assassination, not just Lidice and Lidice, but the thousands of Czechs who were arrested, interrogated, and killed in the weeks that followed, is a specific human cost of Operation Anthropoid. Approximately 5,000 Czech civilians were killed in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. This cost, the 5,000 dead, the destroyed villages, the children who were gassed or given to SS families and renamed, has been the specific moral weight that has attached to the Heydrich assassination ever since. And it is a weight that deserves direct engagement rather than the simplification that either celebrates the assassination as an unambiguous act of heroic resistance or condemns it as an unacceptable sacrifice of civilian lives. The men who made the decision to carry out Operation Anthropoid, Beneš and the Czech government in exile, the British SOE, and ultimately Gabčík and Kubis themselves, had to weigh the specific military and political objectives against the specific price that the Czech population would pay for the operation. They knew that retribution would come. The specific scale of what came, the destruction of entire villages, the murder of thousands of civilians, was perhaps more extreme than they anticipated, though the general pattern of Nazi collective punishment was well established and should have been predictable. The honest engagement with this question, whether the assassination of Heydrich was worth the price that the Czech population paid, is one that does not have a comfortable answer. The man who was killed was the architect of the Holocaust, the administrator of the most comprehensive terror apparatus in occupied Europe, the person most directly responsible after Hitler and Himmler for the ongoing murder of millions of people. His removal was a genuine contribution to the disruption of the Nazi security apparatus and to the demonstration that Nazi power in occupied Europe was vulnerable. But the people who paid the price of his removal were the specific civilians of Lidice and the broader Czech population, people who had not chosen to conduct the assassination and who had no meaningful ability to prevent the retribution that followed. The children of Lidice who were gassed at Chelmno were not weighing the strategic value of killing Heydrich. They were children who died because 2 paratroopers threw a grenade at the right car. Heydrich himself, the man whose death occasioned this price, is one of the most comprehensively evil figures of the entire Second World War. The WWII conference that he chaired coordinated the murder of 6 million people. The Einsatzgruppen that he commanded murdered approximately 2 million Jews in the Soviet territories before WWII. The Gestapo that he effectively controlled produced a specific terror of Nazi-occupied Europe that imprisoned, tortured, and killed hundreds of thousands. His death removed the most capable administrator of Nazi terror from the scene. The moral weight of Operation Anthropoid, the specific calculation that the British SOE and the Czech government in exile made when they decided to kill the man who had chaired the WWII conference, is one that the historical scholarship has engaged with extensively without resolving it in a way that satisfies every ethical perspective. The utilitarian calculation that killing Heydrich was worth the price is available and defensible. The deontological objection that using Czech civilians as the instrument of a geopolitical decision they had not made is morally impermissible regardless of the outcome is also available and defensible. He designed the Holocaust. He was killed by 2 paratroopers with a grenade. The villages were destroyed. The children were gassed. The paratroopers died in a cathedral crypt. Heydrich's death disrupted the Nazi security apparatus and demonstrated the vulnerability of the occupation. The price was paid by people who had not chosen to pay it. All of this is true simultaneously. The full accounting requires all of it. That is the Heydrich War, the man with the iron heart, the WWII conference, the hairpin bend on the Prague street, the grenade, the villages that were erased, the children who were gassed, the paratroopers who died in the cathedral, and the specific moral weight of decision that killed a monster and cost civilians their lives. That is the full accounting of what the Heydrich War was. The specific individuals who were caught between Heydrich and the paratroopers, The Czech families who sheltered Gabčík and Kubis in the months before the assassination, the Czech resistance network that provided support and intelligence, the Czech collaborator who eventually betrayed the paratroopers' hiding place, represent the full range of human responses to the specific moral situation of occupation. The families who sheltered the paratroopers, who knew what they were doing and who accepted the specific risk that discovery would mean death, not just for themselves, but for everyone connected to them, were performing acts of extraordinary moral courage. They were protecting men who were in their homes specifically to kill a senior Nazi official, with the full understanding that if the operation succeeded or if the sheltering was discovered, the retribution would be catastrophic. The specific families whose names are known from the historical record, the Moravec family, who provided shelter and support in the months before the assassination, and one of whose members died by cyanide rather than betraying information under Gestapo interrogation, are part of full human accounting of what Operation Anthropoid was and what it cost. Marie Kovarnikova was a woman who provided shelter to the paratroopers. She was arrested, tortured, and executed. Her family was killed. The specific individuals who paid the highest prices for their participation in the operation are part of the full story that the heroic narrative of the assassination tends to simplify. Karel Kurda was a Czech paratrooper who had been dropped into the territory as part of a different operation, and who, under the pressure of the Nazi retribution following the assassination, went to Gestapo and provided the information that led to the discovery of the cathedral crypt where the paratroopers were hiding. He received a reward of 1 million Reichsmarks and a new identity. He was tried and executed by hanging in Prague in 1947. His betrayal is one of the specific human details of the Heydrich story that the straightforward heroic narrative does not always engage with. The specific moral failure of a man under conditions of extreme pressure who chose to save his own life by providing the information that sent his comrades to their deaths. The Gestapo used the information Kurda provided to identify the families who had sheltered the paratroopers. Those families were arrested and most were killed. The specific chain of consequence, from Kurda's betrayal through the arrest of the families to the deaths in Cathedral Crypt, is part of the full story of what Operation Anthropoid cost the specific people who were connected to it. The Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague, where the paratroopers made their last stand, is now one of the most significant memorial sites of the Czech resistance. The specific physical space of the crypt where they died has been preserved, and the bullet holes in the walls and the flooding damage in the SS attempt to drive them out with water are part of the specific physical evidence of what happened there on June 18, 1942. The archbishop who sheltered the paratroopers in the cathedral, Archbishop Gorazd Matej Pavlik, was arrested after the battle and executed in September 1942. 3 other church officials were also executed. The specific price paid by the church community that provided the final shelter is part of the full accounting of the operation. The village of Lidice was rebuilt after the war. The specific village that was built is not on the same site as the original. The original site was designated as a memorial ground, but the community reconstituted itself and has maintained its identity as the village that was erased and then restored. The memorial at the original site includes a preserved ground of the village, a sculpture of the children who were killed, and a specific documentation of what was done there in June 1942. The international solidarity that the destruction of Lidice generated, the communities in Britain, the United States, Mexico, and other countries that renamed themselves Lidice, is part of the specific political response to the assassination's aftermath. The village of Stern Park Gardens in Illinois renamed itself Lidice. A mining community in Venezuela named a street after Lidice. The specific global resonance of the village's destruction was part of the Allied propaganda war's success in communicating the character of a Nazi regime. The children of Lidice who survived the war, the few who had been identified as suitable for Germanization and placed with SS families, faced a specific post-war challenge of recovering a Czech identity that had been systematically suppressed during their German upbringing. Some were successfully reunited with surviving family members. Some were not, because the surviving family members were too few to identify the children, or because the children themselves had no memory of their original families. The specific psychological and identity dimensions of their experience are part of the full human cost of the retribution. The paratroopers' names, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, and the 5 who died with them, are commemorated in the Czech national memory with the specific reverence that genuine heroes deserve. The specific qualities of courage and sacrifice that they demonstrated, the willingness to undertake an operation they knew would cost them their lives, the specific fighting quality they showed in Cathedral Crypt, are real and deserve acknowledgement. They killed the man who chaired the WWII conference. They died in a cathedral. The villages were erased. The children were gassed. And the man who designed the Holocaust died of septicemia 8 days after the grenade exploded near his car. That is the full human texture of the Heydrich War. The specific place of the Heydrich assassination in the history of targeted killing. The deliberate elimination of specific enemy leaders as an instrument of warfare and resistance is one that the historical and legal scholarship has engaged in the context of the laws of war and the specific practices of modern conflict. Targeted killing has a history as long as warfare itself. But the specific question of whether the assassination of an enemy official, as opposed to killing an enemy soldier in combat, is permissible under the laws of war is one that different legal traditions have answered differently. The specific German prosecution of Czech resistance members who were captured and tried after the war was based on the claim that the assassination was a crime rather than a military operation. The Allied position was that Heydrich was a legitimate target of war as a senior military officer of the occupying power. The specific ambiguity of Heydrich's status, he was simultaneously an SS officer, a senior administrator of the occupation government, and the operational head of the Nazi terror apparatus, made him a target that different legal frameworks would categorize differently. The Allied position was that he was a legitimate military target. The German legal framework of the occupation characterized his killing as murder. The post-war legal development of targeted killing doctrine has not fully resolved these questions and the specific practices of modern conflict. The use of targeted killing by states against non-state actors, the specific legal debates about the scope of legitimate targeting, reflect the ongoing engagement with questions that the Heydrich assassination posed in a particularly sharp form. The specific contribution of Operation Anthropoid to the development of resistance doctrine, the demonstration that a small number of trained operatives could successfully attack a senior enemy official even under conditions of intense Nazi security, was an important lesson for the SOE and for subsequent resistance organizations. The specific operational techniques that Gabčík and Kubis used, the ambush at a road bend that required Heydrich's car to slow, the combination of weapons that would have addressed the car from multiple angles if the Sten gun had not jammed, were the product of professional training applied to a specific intelligence picture, and the operation's success despite the specific failure of the primary weapon demonstrated both the quality of the planning and the courage of the execution. The specific failure of Gabčík's Sten gun, which has been the subject of considerable subsequent analysis about the reliability of the weapon and the specific maintenance conditions that may have contributed to malfunction, is one of the details that makes the Heydrich story more than a clean narrative of trained professionals executing a planned operation. The jam gun meant that the assassination succeeded not because the primary plan worked, but because Kubis had the presence of mind to throw the grenade in the specific moment when the primary plan had failed. The specific improvisation, the decision to proceed with the secondary weapon when the primary had failed, with a German SS officer already aware that he was being attacked, was an act of operational courage under pressure that the training could not fully prepare for. The specific relationship between the assassination and the broader Allied intelligence and resistance operations in occupied Europe is worth noting because it illustrates the specific military logic that made the operation worth conducting despite the predictable cost of the retribution. The Nazi security apparatus under Heydrich was a primary obstacle to the maintenance of resistance networks in occupied Europe. His specific combination of intelligence capabilities and operational ruthlessness had been disrupting resistance organizations across the continent, and the specific pacification of Czech resistance that he had been achieving since his arrival in September 1941 was eliminating the intelligence assets that the British and Czech services depended on. His removal, even at the cost of the retribution that followed, was a specific military objective that the Allied intelligence services had determined was worth the price. Whether that determination was correct is a judgment that the historical record presents for the reader rather than resolves. The specific intelligence and resistance benefits of removing Heydrich were real. The specific cost, Lidice, the children, the thousands of deaths, was also real. The balance between these real things is not a calculation that the historical record can perform for the reader. The men who made the decision, Benes, the SOE commanders, the Czech intelligence officers, were making it under the specific conditions of wartime decision-making, with incomplete information about what the retribution would look like, and with the specific urgency of a situation in which the Czech resistance was being dismantled by the man they were trying to kill. The men who executed the decision, Gabčík and Kubis and their comrades, were doing so with the full knowledge that success would cost them their lives, because the Nazi retribution would pursue them to the end regardless of where they hid. They chose to proceed. They killed Heydrich. They died in the cathedral crypt. The specific courage of that sequence of choices is real and deserves to be acknowledged as real. He designed the Holocaust. He was killed by 2 paratroopers with a grenade. The villages were erased. The children were gassed. The paratroopers died in a flooded crypt. And the man who chaired the WWII conference died of blood poisoning 8 days after the grenade exploded near his car. All of this is true. All of it belongs in the same accounting. The moral weight of the Holocaust that Heydrich administered, the moral weight of the Lidice children who paid for his death, the moral courage of the paratroopers who gave their lives to kill him, the moral failure of the collaborator who betrayed the men who killed him, the moral ambiguity of the exile government that made the decision that started all of it belongs in the same accounting. The full truth of the Heydrich War is not comfortable. It is not simple. It does not resolve into a clean narrative of heroism and villainy, though both genuine heroism and genuine villainy are present in it. He designed the architecture of murder. 2 paratroopers stopped the heart of the man who designed it. The price was paid by people who had not chosen to pay it. That is the full accounting. That is the Heydrich War. The specific post-war legal proceedings that address the crimes of the Nazi security apparatus, including proceedings that addressed Heydrich's specific role in the Holocaust, are part of the full accounting of the historical record that Operation Anthropoid's target left behind. The Nuremberg successor trials, the Einsatzgruppen trial of 1947-48, which specifically addressed the mobile killing units that Heydrich had commanded and deployed in the Soviet territories, produced convictions and death sentences for commanders of the Einsatzgruppen who had carried out the mass murders in the East. Heydrich himself was dead, and the specific legal accountability that the trial provided was therefore addressed to his subordinates rather than to him. The specific documentation of the Einsatzgruppen killings, the reports that the units had submitted to Heydrich's headquarters documenting the numbers of people they had killed, was preserved in the German archives and constituted some of the most damning evidence of the Holocaust scale at the Nuremberg proceedings. The reports are remarkable documents in the specific way that WWII is a remarkable document. The bureaucratic matter-of-factness of the accounting, the specific numbers recorded without emotional register, the administrative normalization of mass murder, and they are part of the historical record that Heydrich's organizational culture produced. Adolf Eichmann, who had prepared the minutes of the WWII conference under Heydrich's direction and who was responsible for the logistical coordination of the deportations to the extermination camps, was tried in Jerusalem in 1961. Nearly 20 years after the conference he had documented. His trial was a specific legal proceeding that brought the most detailed public accounting of the WWII conference and its consequences to the widest audience, and the specific WWII minutes that Heydrich had directed Eichmann to prepare became one of the central documents of the trial. Hannah Arendt's coverage of the Eichmann trial, which produced her analysis of the banality of evil, engaged specifically with the WWII minutes and with the specific character of the bureaucratic administration of mass murder that Heydrich and Eichmann had developed together. The specific concept she developed, that the evil of the Holocaust was in significant part the evil of ordinary people carrying out extraordinary crimes through mechanisms of bureaucratic normality, was an engagement with the specific organizational culture that Heydrich had built. Heydrich had been more than ordinarily evil in Arendt's specific sense. He was a man of genuine intellectual gifts who had applied those gifts completely to the design and administration of murder. But the specific organizational culture he created, the culture that normalized mass murder through bureaucratic procedure, was a mechanism that made the Holocaust possible at the scale achieved, and that culture was a specific contribution to the history of the 20th century. His death removed him from the scene before the full consequences of what it set in motion were realized. The extermination camps that operated after his death, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, Chelmno, processed the deportations that the WWII framework had coordinated. The 6 million people who died in the Holocaust died after his assassination in the machinery he had helped design and set in motion. He did not live to see what he had built achieve its full operation. He died of blood poisoning in a Prague hospital while the Holocaust was still in its early phases. The specific scale of what followed, the full industrial murder of European Jewry, was a consequence of his work, executed after his death by the apparatus he had designed. The 2 paratroopers who killed him and the 5 who died with him in the cathedral crypt stopped one life. The Holocaust continued. The machinery was self-sustaining. The architecture of murder that Heydrich had designed did not require Heydrich to continue operating. This is a specific limitation of the assassination as a strategic instrument in the specific circumstances of the Holocaust. The individual, however central, was not the irreplaceable element of the system that had already been built and that continued to function without him. The assassination disrupted the Nazi security apparatus. It did not stop the Holocaust. The Czech government in exile knew this might be the case. The specific political reasons for the operation, the demonstration of Czech resistance, the strengthening of the case for Czech sovereignty in the post-war settlement were real reasons that reflected the specific political situation of the exile government. They were not primarily reasons about the Holocaust. They were reasons about Czech national survival in the post-war order. The specific moral complexity of Operation Anthropoid, the specific combination of political calculation, military resistance, human cost, and historical consequence, is a complexity that the full accounting requires engaging with. He designed the Holocaust. He was killed before it reached its full scale. The apparatus he built continued without him. The villages were erased. The children were gassed. The paratroopers died. And the Holocaust killed 6 million people in the machinery he had helped design. That is the Heydrich War. All of it, the architecture of murder and the grenade, and the villages and the children, and the paratroopers in the cathedral, and the 6 million who died in the machinery that outlasted him. That is the full accounting. The specific films and novels and dramatic works that have addressed the Heydrich assassination reflect the specific qualities of the story that make it so amenable to dramatic treatment. The clear villain, the specific heroes, the hairpin bend in Prague, the jam gun, the grenade, the dying man who drew his pistol and pursued his attackers on foot before collapsing. These elements have the specific dramatic shape of a set piece, and the dramatic treatments have generally handled them well. The 1943 Hollywood film Hangman Also Die, directed by Fritz Lang, written by Bertolt Brecht, produced while the war was ongoing, was the first major dramatic treatment of the assassination. The film's specific approach was to present the assassination as a collective act of Czech resistance rather than to focus on the individual paratroopers, reflecting the specific propaganda context of the film and the specific political purposes it was designed to serve. The 2016 film Anthropoid, which focused directly on Gabčík and Kubis and the specific details of the operation, was a more historically grounded treatment that engaged with the specific complexity of the operation and its consequences. The film's attention to the specific operational details, the months of preparation, the specific families who sheltered the paratroopers, the cathedral crypt battle, produced one of the more accurate dramatic treatments of the story. The 2017 film HHHH, based on Laurent Benet's novel of the same name, translated into English as A Man with the Iron Heart, provided another treatment that engaged with both the assassination and the specific character of Heydrich himself, attempting the difficult task of rendering the specific combination qualities that made him the most dangerous man in occupied Europe. These dramatic treatments are part of the broader cultural memory of the Heydrich assassination, and they reflect the specific qualities that make the story so compelling. The specific moral clarity of the target, the man who chaired the WWII conference, combined with the specific moral complexity of the cause, the village of children who were gassed, and the specific human drama of the paratroopers who gave their lives to kill him. The dramatic treatments cannot, by the nature of the form, hold the full complexity. They tend toward the specific elements that work dramatically. The assassination itself, the last stand in the cathedral, at the expense of broader moral engagement with what the assassination cost and what it achieved. The full accounting requires the broader engagement that the dramatic form tends to sacrifice for dramatic effect. The man with the iron heart died on June 4th, 1942. The 2 men who stopped his heart died on June 18th, 1942. The children of Lidice died at Chelmno in the weeks that followed. All of them are in this story. All of them deserve to be named. That is the full accounting. That is the Heydrich War.